Welcome everyone to the latest webinar in our Peak Performer webinar series. This series is designed to support your leadership climb by bringing the most trusted experts to the Vistage community, who provide exceptional insight and best practices that help you navigate new challenges and possibilities. Today's focus is on protecting your business from cyber threats. We've invited a panel of experts to discuss the foundations of cyber strategy for the CEO, cyber in the hybrid workforce, what to do when you've been hacked, and how to keep your personal and professional information safe. Today, our expert panel includes Carla Stone, President and CEO of Techguard, Mike Foster, CEO of the Foster Institute, and Russell Saferstein, CEO of Redpoint Security. Now, I'd like to introduce Joe Galvin, Vistage Chief Research Officer, our moderator for today's session. Joe, over to you.
Thank you, and welcome everyone. You know, in the face of everything that's going on with COVID, the challenges of return to work, of hiring, the inflation and supply chain, the most serious and persistent threat to your business is cyber attacks. And while we're all consumed with everything going on with cyber, it seems like every day there's something new in the news about a cyber attack. This is not new news. We've all heard this, we've been exposed to it, but it seems like it's really intensified most recently. It's a cyber alert. We've asked this question for the last 4 years in our survey. Has your company experienced a cyber attack or threat in the past 12 months? Ask yourself that question, because our data shows year over year about 25 to 30% have. And I'm sure if we were to ask our experts, they would say that's vastly underreported. You know, cyber almost begins to feel like COVID. You probably haven't had it, but you know someone who has, or know of someone that has. And some people, it bounces off of them, some get sick, and some have real serious issues. Cyber is the same thing, except there's not a vaccine for it. It is a most clear and present threat to your business that there is. Another question we ask: does your company have a defined cyber risk strategy that is documented and communicated to executives? Do you have an active cyber strategy plan to defend your business? And we've been asking this question over time, but here's our results from Q4 2020, so December of last year, just 6 months ago. 49% said yes, that we had a current strategy, right? But 17% said the strategy isn't current, 13% say no, but we're working on it, and 21%, amazingly, 21% have no strategy in place at all. That means that 51% of our community is unprotected. And much like COVID and the vaccine, even if you have protection, you're still vulnerable. You can still be exposed. This is a clear and present danger to your business. The good news is we've seen a real improvement in our community. When we first started researching and talking about and sharing this data in 2017, just 38% of our community answered yes to that question. Now we're up to 49%, which means we're seeing improvement and we're seeing recognition. But if you think about all the things that are going on with COVID and return to work and changing customers and a booming economy and et cetera, the last thing you need now is to get shut down. The last thing you need is to lose access to your data. And that's what cyber attacks do. And unless you're fluent in blockchain and Bitcoin and you're ready to drop that to get the decryption key, you are at risk. And imagine running your business with no data, right? Just put your computer to black, and that's what your data says, unless you pay X. And that's why this is such an important topic. We published a report in 2018 based on this. It outlines some of the key frameworks, places, and ways for CEOs to think about cyber, because again, it'll take your business down as sudden as a heart attack, right? We ask you to assess the strength of your cybersecurity. We ask you to create a layered defense, which is more than just buying the technology. We talk about using insurance to mitigate the cost. It's not going to prevent the hack, and it's not going to prevent the disruption, but it can mitigate some of those issues, just like some of your other mitigation strategies. And probably most important, and the best piece of advice I can give you, is to call a cybersecurity expert. And that's exactly what we did for this session today. We brought in 5 of the very best folks that we have in our community to help us with this. We have Carla Stone joining us. Carla is the CEO of Techguard Security, and she's going to be talking to us about cyber strategy, the overview, the high-level concepts we need to understand about cyber. Next, we'll be going to Mike Foster, award-winning and legendary Vistage speaker, highly rated on all things cyber and technology. Mike's going to take a really real-time view into the impacts of cyber in the hybrid environment. We all of us that could, the professional staff that could, all went to a work-from-home model 15, 18 months ago. And now that model in some form of hybrid is going to be retained in 68% of our organizations. So what are the cyber realities we need to know for hybrid? And Mike's going to help us with that. And then we're going to go to Russell Saferstein. Russell is a Vistage member out of New York City. He's a CEO, president CEO of Redpoint Cybersecurity, and one of their areas of expertise is remediation. Okay, you put in your best plan, you adjusted for the hybrid, boom, you still got hacked. Or maybe you don't have no plan. You assume that it's not going to hit you. You don't have any plan. Sorry, you don't have a plan and it's not going to hit you. Well, Russell's going to give you some ideas about what to do when you get hacked, because not only is timing important, but the right sequences of steps is equally important. So we've got a great group for you today. We're very excited to share this information and make this available to the Vistage community and beyond. So with that, let me start and turn to Carla and say, Carla, welcome. Thank you. And let's get us started.
Thanks, Joe. We appreciate it. We're excited to be here today. So as the CEO, your organization's cybersecurity program starts and ends with you. You are responsible. What does that mean? When we tell most business owners and CEOs that exact information, the typical response is, I don't know what that means. I don't know where to start. How can I be responsible for something that I have no idea where to begin? So what we're going to do today is we're going to give you an overview of what your cybersecurity program should look like, what you as a CEO should be involved in. You're not the person that should be implementing the program. You should assign someone within your organization. It should be their full-time duty to run your cybersecurity program. Gone are the days where you can dual hat your HR person, dual hat your IT person, your accounting person, whatever that looks like. You need to assign a full-time resource within your organization to run the program for you. That person should have direct access to you at all times. But along the way of the program, there are certain areas in which you should be responsible for, or at least have insight and input into what that looks like. So we put together a quick cybersecurity agenda. And in that, we're going to determine what your valuable assets are. We're going to assess your current cybersecurity maturity. We're going to establish your organization's risk threshold. And then we're going to give you some ideas of how to monitor and improve that. The first thing we're going to talk about is your valuable data and assets. And just remember, what's valuable to you may not be valuable to the adversary, and vice versa. What an adversary may find valuable is something you may not. So a lot of people refer to this as your asset inventory. Now, when we say that to a lot of CEOs who have a lot of accounting backgrounds and things like that, they hear fixed assets. That's not what we're talking about in this. We're talking about your customer records, your intellectual property, your banking information of your customers. If you look at the right side of the chart, it's what the adversaries are targeting. Now, they're still targeting customer records, intellectual property, credit cards, financial information. That's a priority list, but just think about it. They're going to go after the lowest hanging fruit. So you should basically prioritize all of those. What does that mean? For each of these items, you should know where your data is located. So think about your customer data, right? You might have your customer data information in an ERP and a CRM and the accounting system, in backups, in archives. Everywhere it's located, it needs to be protected. So all of a sudden, securing your customer information that you think is just in your CRM or something like that becomes a much larger process because it's located in so many places. The next thing you need to think about is who manages access. And not only who manages the access, but who has access and is it applicable for them to have the access. We recently had a customer that had 1,100 employees, decent sized customer, right? 1,100 employees. 800 of those employees had full access to the domain controllers, meaning they could do anything they wanted to within the system if they realized they had that control. So one of the things I do personally is I'll go to my IT department and I'll just ask them for the list of who has access to what systems. And that could be hardware, it could be software, it could be systems, it could be anything like that. We see a lot of people having access that don't necessarily need it, and it just gives you additional risk. There's just additional risk involved with that. The next thing you need to do is assess your current cybersecurity maturity. We call this a gap analysis. So every industry has a framework in which they are required to comply with. If you don't have a framework, there's some that we recommend, whether it be NIST, CIS Top 20, or if you do work internationally, they're going to look for an ISO certification. These frameworks range in anywhere from 50 to 300 different controls. Those controls can be soft controls. So if you look at the gap analysis side, we're talking about, do you have an incident response plan? Are you training your employees? Who has controls and accesses? There's also the technical side, the vulnerability assessment. What are your vulnerabilities and what are your gaps? So the first thing you need to do is figure out what framework you need to comply with, and then do a gap analysis against that framework to see what your vulnerabilities are. Now, one of the things that as a CEO you should definitely be involved in is setting your risk threshold. So what risk are you willing to accept? And there's multiple ways of doing this. But you should definitely decide that if you determine that you have a vulnerability, say, and it's a medium, and you're willing to accept that risk for, say, 60 days, you want to know if you've reached 61 days and why. Why are your risks still out there? Why are you accepting risks that you have not agreed to accept? So there's a whole process that you go through with that. First, you're going to select your methodology. You're going to assign your thresholds. You're going to set your operating procedures and strategies to measure against those thresholds. And then you're going to conduct your normal business, right? We're all in business to make money. We all have to run a business. But you're going to measure and report those risks. Now, compliance says that you should get a risk report annually. We recommend quarterly. I like to get it monthly. And again, if we're outside of a set threshold, I want to know immediately. So this is definitely where the CEO needs to be involved, because ultimately you're responsible. So you need to know why you're accepting risks that you didn't agree to accept. What are the obstacles? So SMBs certainly have more challenges than large companies. We don't have the ability to have large teams of experts, right? So for us, we outsource our legal, we outsource, marketing, different things within the organization. It's kind of the same thing within an SMB for cybersecurity, right? Most SMBs say the reason that they're behind or that they don't have a mature cybersecurity program is because of lack of resources. Those resources could be time, money, expertise, employees, whatever that is. The next one is lack of expertise or understanding. I kind of put that in with resources. And then lack of information, lack of time, and lack of training. Like Joe mentioned in the intro, the rules are changing every single day, right? So there's new threats, there's new vulnerabilities, there's new rules. There's no rules. So we're kind of in the wild, wild west. So the rules are changing every day. So we need to stay on top of those. How do you determine your strategy? You can kind of go about it two different ways. You can decide to have an internal team do all of this for you, or you can outsource some of your cyber needs. Even if you outsource it, you still need an inside resource to manage that for you. And then on to common misconceptions. I'm too small to be a target. 48% of all data breaches happen to SMBs, so companies like Vistage customers. We are the lowest hanging fruit. We don't have the mature vulnerability, 24/7 SOCs running on our networks or managing our vulnerabilities. We are the lowest hanging fruit. A lot of people say, I outsource my IT, so I don't need to have a plan. If you have an MSP, that's great. Your MSP should be providing you compliance reports based on your compliance needs. If you aren't getting these reports, you should be asking for them. Also, ask your MSP if they're getting risk assessments. done and what those results of those risk assessments are. A lot of people think it's too expensive. I'd rather take the risk. Well, the estimates for a small is $2 per month per employee to actually do the controls audit, the vulnerability assessments, the training, the phishing that's needed. Phishing is still the #1 attack vector. No matter how much we train our employees, no matter what we do, phishing is still the #1 attack vector. We phish our employees on a regular basis. We phish our employees most holidays, beginning of summer, any big event, right? We phish our employees, train them on how to look for those types of emails. A lot of people will say, I had an audit done a couple years ago. Well, cybersecurity is not one and done. It's an ongoing thing. Again, if you've had any changes in your organization, you've created a new division, you had an M&A, you went to work from home, you went from on-prem to cloud, you need to do another audit, right? You don't have to do a full-blown audit, but you still have to do an audit. I guarantee if any of those events occurred, things changed. Accesses were given. You're vulnerable. So anytime you have any type of change in your organization, make sure you go back and revisit it. And then the last one is, I'll never get this done. It's too overwhelming. That's not the case. It's pretty streamlined at this point. We have, customers that we can get them in a really good position in 2 to 3 months. It doesn't have to be that big, audacious thing that you lose sleep over for the next year or two. I mean, you can be in a pretty good position pretty quickly, as long as you make the decision that it's important to you from the top down, and your employees know that it's important to you. I think that's it, Joe.
Great, Carla. Thank you. That was very insightful. I want to get back so people can get a look at your contact information. Sorry. There we go. Thank you. That was excellent. A great overview and a clear warning to all of the folks on today and that will listen to this in the future to set us up for the day. At this point, I'd like to bring back Mike and Russell to come back in and add color to what we just heard. Mike, let me start with you. What was it you heard from Carla that sparked some thinking on your side?
One of the biggest things I heard from Carla is that security is not a one-time thing. There's no such thing as a get it and set it and you're finished. It's ongoing. It's always changing. The attackers are constantly picking new methods to break in, and therefore you have to respond. It's kind of like a cat and mouse game, and the mouse is always going to be ahead.
Yeah, Russell, how about you?
Yeah, I kind of echo that. I think, cybersecurity is definitely a journey. It's not a one and done. That was something that kind of resonated with me. And when I talk to my clients, I'm too small to be a target. We have to move past that as well. I think that's a critical element to, and on my side of the house, when we work on breaches, it could be the Ford dealer in Missouri, or it could be, a Fortune 100 company. It doesn't really matter. They're all equally, targeted. And Carla made a really good point. The amount of money that they have to spend, the larger companies, the smaller companies don't have that. So they're definitely more at risk in that regard.
Carla, one of the points you made is to have someone have this be their full-time job. But we also know as businesses get smaller, we simply don't have that resource available. How do folks in those situations manage or address this?
I would say the smaller the organization, it doesn't have to be 100% a full-time job, but it does have to be their top priority. It can't come after everything else is done. And the smaller you are, I think the more important it is to outsource a lot of that. Let somebody handhold you through the process. So you have that internal person be the liaison within that organization to make sure that everything's running smooth, to make sure that everything's getting done in a timely manner. But again, it has to be a priority. That has to be their #1 focus. It can't be when everything else is done, I'll get to that, at the end of the day or the week, because that time will never come.
For any of you, have you seen an increase in activity as a result of COVID, or is it pretty much status quo in terms of organizations looking to move into that column of fully protected and prepared?
Definitely been an increase in activity on both sides of the house, both from the threat actors as well from organizations that are starting to take notice of it. I think, Joe, you put up a slide earlier about where organizations were beforehand to where they are today. People are spending more money, which is good, but sometimes when you're coming from zero, the amount of money you need to spend can be daunting, and I understand that process very, very well.
Mike, what would you say to someone who says, well, I have my plan in place, I'm protected, we review it every year, we're good?
Oh, well, certainly, in addition to what we've already talked about, the attackers, especially you mentioned with COVID, there's no such thing as being already all set up. And I'll tell you more about that here in a minute when I get my chance. But the attackers are constantly finding new ways to get in. They will attack someone's home computer, and then they get to find out where the person works. So they're just constantly reaching out. The attack surface is so much larger now that companies can hit, or attackers can hit companies with so many different options, so many different locations. And as far as people responding, companies protecting themselves, we finally passed the threshold. We were so excited. We celebrated a couple of days ago. We now have more customers being proactive than we have customers who had a breach and then called us and then they decided to become secure.
It sounds like this is a battle that will rage for all time in increasing levels of intensity and sophistication. So Carla, thank you very much. I greatly appreciate your insights, and more importantly, we'll be listening for your comments. As we bring on Mike, Mike Foster is going to speak to us about cybersecurity for hybrid. As I mentioned, Mike is a legendary Vistage speaker. With 68% of our community having some form of hybrid and so many of us having fled to work from home, this concept of cybersecurity in the hybrid environment excuse me, is one that's really important. And that's why it's so great to have Mike with us here to share us with it. So Mike, let me turn it to you and hear what your thoughts are on cybersecurity in the hybrid workforce.
There are three main points I want to make, and we'll cover them individually. But the first one has to do with understanding passwords are not enough. The second one is you need to secure remote worker computers. Number three is restricting data communications. Before we get into the details, I want to tell you about what happened in New York City last week. I was in Manhattan and needed to get out to the airport, and my Lyft driver, Valentine, he sealed off the front of his car from the back of his car with this Mylar sheet, but he also used a tube, a dryer hose, to connect the air conditioner in the front back into the back so we could be comfortable. But that's pretty neat how I was using a sheet of plastic to sort of enforce a rule that air could go from the front to the back to keep us cool, but germs were not allowed, in theory anyway, back up front to get to him. Computers use rules kind of like that too, and we'll cover them. But let's hit these three items. Number one, understanding passwords are not enough. The real risk is an attacker pwning a home computer, a worker's computer. And when we say pwn, that's a combination of the word own, like have control of, and pawn, like the player in chess. That's a term hackers use when they get into systems or take control. They say they pwned something. Let's give an example. If this is a user that's working from home, even though they put in a username and a password, and maybe they have to fill in a text message, you may go through all this process to make sure the login component is very, very secure, but that's not enough, because what attackers have learned to do is take control of the computer. For example, if she clicks in an email message, clicks a malicious link, of course everybody knows not to click the link, but everybody knows somebody's going to sooner or later. If she clicks a link, the attacker comes in with her. And now the attacker has just as much access as she does. So if she's connected to your office and is working with the data in the office and is able to open files and save files and delete files, now the attacker can do all of that too, because her computer thinks that that attacker is her, and it's not. Same thing if you stored everything in the cloud. Maybe you've moved your whole business to the cloud, so you have nothing local. If you've done that, she still has access to the cloud. So if she does something that lets an attacker in, now the attacker has access to the cloud. You're still not secure. So even though passwords are crucial and two-step logon, that is not what's going to protect you if you don't also protect yourself from being pwned. So number two, securing the remote workers' computers. That has to do with keeping them from getting pwned. Here's a question to ask your IT professionals. Ask them, what security controls do you manage on the remote computers? And some of the answers you want to hear are critical security updates. Find out if they're managing any virus. Hopefully they'll tell you they're using something called application control so that they know what programs are allowed or permitted to run on that computer. That way viruses and unpermitted software can't run. The second thing to know about securing those remote computers is please do not let your remote workers use family computers to connect. Family computers are much easier for an attacker to hack into, to take control over, so you don't want anybody using a family computer. Either issue computers to them to work from home, or if there's a computer at the office that they're not using and you don't want to buy them another computer, you could actually let them use the computer they have at work. You may choose to get them a little wireless adapter, though, to go in that desktop. And they're $10. They look just exactly like that is one. And they could plug that into the computer they usually use at work. Now they work from home on their wireless network, and they get their stuff done, and your IT team can manage those machines. That's really the key to number 2, is that your IT team is keeping those machines secure that the work from home users use. Then the third is restricting data communications back and forth to your office. And most companies these days communicate, lots of them anyway, through a VPN to the remote workers. And you can think of a VPN as being a network cable that's miles and miles long. So if you have a VPN user in Hawaii, and since it's Hawaii, I hope that's you, then it's almost as if you had an Ethernet cable strung all the way from you are in Hawaii, all the way back to your main office. But here's the key thing to know about VPNs. They're not secure unless both ends of the VPN are secure. So each end of that cable must be secure. Otherwise, VPNs are not secure. They're called virtual private networks. They were not even designed to be secure initially. But let me show you how this works. Let's think about bears for a minute. We know some people who live up in the mountains, and they have a house and a barn, and they live where bears are, bear country. Well, they're a little bit concerned about going back and forth between the two because a bear might get them. So what they did is they built a tunnel. So now it's easy to go back and forth without having to be concerned about the bears. Well, let's think of the bear as being a hacker for a moment. And that tunnel can be the same as a VPN. In fact, frequently that's how we talk about VPNs in the cybersecurity technical world, is we'll say, well, we're tunneling the data through. Then everybody knows that we're talking about VPNs. But if that house is a worker, and then the building is the office, now everything's safe and the VPN is protecting it unless somebody forgets and they leave the door open. So going back to the actual bear instead of the hacker, if someone were to leave the door open in the house or even the door open in the barn, now the bear can go right through the tunnel and becomes a severe danger. And it's the same exact problem with a VPN. So that takes us back to what we said a moment ago. A VPN is only secure if both ends are secure. So we talked about securing the worker by making their computer safe. That was in the second of these 3 things we're talking about. So the third item is to be able to protect the end on the office side. And the way to solve this is to use what we refer to as a bear DNA detector. I don't want to get too technical. I'm going to be explaining more about what to do, but I do want to give you enough information you'll be able to communicate with your IT professional. But the way that bear DNA detector works, if you could imagine that you put that detector inside the tunnel. So now if a human approaches the tunnel, the human's allowed through. However, if it's a bear, the bear gets stopped. It's very simple. And what you want to ask your IT professionals is, do we isolate or filter VPN connections? And what that means is your IT team will put in rules such as they'll let something called remote desktop protocol go back and forth through the tunnel, but they would not allow drive sharing to go through the tunnel. Anything the attackers could take advantage of, they'll block, but anything a user needs to do to be able to do their job, they'll allow that to still happen. It's sort of like we talked about with Valentine, how your IT professionals now will be able to control what direction and what data goes from one place to another. So in summary, the first one is understanding that passwords are not enough. The real risk is pwning. And please know you do need those passwords, and 2-step verification is essential. The second item, secure your remote worker computers. I want to be sure you take away that don't let people use home computers, and make sure that you've issued the machines so that your IT team can keep those computers secure. And then the third one, restricting data communications back and forth to your office, simply means don't let the bears get into the tunnel. There has to be isolation protecting both sides of the VPN.
Wow. Well, Mike, thank you very much for that. Here's your contact information for Mike and the Foster Institute. And so Mike, I want to bring you back on and bring our group back together and say, so Carla and Russ, if you come back in. Carla, let me start with you. What were your thoughts on this, and what are your thoughts on cybersecurity and the hybrid workforce?
Yeah, so we saw a huge increase in vulnerabilities with the quick work from home scenario when the pandemic hit, right? So every company should have their BYOD, their bring your own device policy. I completely agree. They should never be accessing your network from home computers, personal computers, or any of that type of thing. We have a very strict BYOD policy here. Some companies aren't quite as strict from ours, but it's definitely a major issue right now.
Russell, I'm sure you see a lot of this, especially on the remediation side of the hybrid workers. What can you share?
But first of all, I think the bear should have had a hoodie on. That's all I want to say about that. but yeah, absolutely. I think ultimately, when you start thinking about, how are we protecting that remote workforce, is, Mike brought up a couple really good points about how securing our home computers is critically important, and also as we are restricting data between our offices and our home. Again, with all the remote workers that we have, we definitely are seeing, definitely saw an increase and still seeing an increase in activity on the threat actor side because of everyone working remotely.
Carla had mentioned earlier how things had changed, and this is clearly an example of how with the dispersed workforce, and we will see in a more remote and hybrid workforce going forward, that cyber just got even more complicated. Mike, have you seen folks on the end of the VPN? Have you seen examples where that's led to big problems?
Yes, absolutely. There's a company in Philadelphia that suffered a major breach, and they thought they had everything all secure because they were using great passwords and having people do a two-step logon kind of authentication. And one of their people used a family computer, and the attacker got in through the family computer into the network and shut their entire system down. And part of the ransomware note was, do not try to restore your data. The attackers had gotten in and they were dwelling in the system. And sure enough, our client tried to reinstall the data. And all of a sudden, when they tried to restore, then the attackers took everything to its knees. They wiped out something called VMware, which is the foundation of their entire network. And it would all been saved had that worker not been using a family computer, or if they'd isolated the connection so the bears couldn't get into the main company. And
how long were the bears able to feed in the kitchen?
We don't know how long the attackers were in. They were probably in months because they had gone in and identified everything. In fact, there's another instance we had where an attacker got in and found the insurance policy and read the insurance policy, so they knew how much the cyber limits were. So they tailored the ransom demand to match that exactly.
How long was that account? How long was that client rather? How long were they down without data?
Oh, down without data. They were down. They managed to get their information back up within about 4 days, but they could not restore the ERP for much longer. And it's because they weren't backing up the data properly for the ERP. When you back up databases, the database has to first be converted in what's called a flat file, a static representation. If you try to back up database files, they're constantly changing and you'll end up with something you can't restore. But part of the backup process should be to cause that database make a static copy, back that up, and then whenever you restore the static copy, then they could have told the ERP, all right, pick up where that left off. But they failed to back up properly. So they're still reeling from that attack, and it was more than a year ago.
So Mike, is it safe? I'm sorry, go ahead, Russell.
I was gonna say, it's a really good point, Mike, in terms of going through a process where you actually test your backup process and bring it up, in a test environment. I have too many examples of, companies that did not do that and then, were worse for wear because of that.
Thank you. In fact, we've started using the term when we tell people we don't say test your backups, we actually say practice restoring, because we wanted to get them into that thought process. But just like you pointed out, it needs to be a test environment. It's not always as easy as just saying, okay, we're going to practice restoring, but it's something organizations must go through. When you get ransomware, it's not the first time, not best to have that be your first time you practice restoring.
Absolutely.
So Mike, is it safe to say if you have not made an update or an adjustment to your cyber strategy to address the hybrid workforce, that the bears are looking for ways to get in and they'll find them?
Yes, that's kind of like saying there are fires on the West Coast. You're darn right. And I hope everybody knows it too. Yeah, huge exposure from work from home people and opportunities to solve it.
Well, great, Mike. Thank you so much for that insight. It's so current and it's so relevant. It's so real time. With that, again, thank you, Mike. Let's turn to Russell now. Russell, you're a Vistage member. You live it as a CEO, but your business is all about this, specifically around remediation. Give us some insight, please.
I have a lot of stories to tell, as I say, about ransomware and kind of what is going on in this space. And I think in a lot of ways, when we start thinking about it, first things first. I mentioned earlier, cybersecurity is a journey, and you need to understand that there really are no boundaries relating to this. There are attacks happening across the globe relating to cybersecurity. I got a study yesterday across my desk that the number of breaches relating to ransomware in the first half of 2021 were up over 150% over this time last year. And again, thinking about last year, the beginning of COVID, the fact that we all were working from home, et cetera, we thought that it was going to be rising at a steep pace. They're even rising even faster this year. One thing that came out of that study that was really interesting was the United States got hit with 227 million cases of ransomware in the first 6 months of this year. The next largest country was Great Britain, which was 14 million. So just let that sink in a little bit about ransomware and what's happening here, especially in the US, that we are absolutely being targeted and we are at war relating to ransomware. And we need to make sure we have an end game strategy relating to this as well. So one of the things we want to walk through is what happens when an actual ransomware case actually hits. What happens in that process? And Joe, you actually asked the question earlier, how long were they in the system? Many times they're in the system for months, weeks, etc. We have a case recently that we're working on right now, we're just finalizing it, where the threat actors were in the system from December and they got hit with ransomware in June, the end of June. So they were there almost 6 months, taking a really good asset inventory, as Carla mentioned earlier, understanding what actually was going on, doing a lot of understanding about their particular network, where the compromises could potentially be. So whether that's through phishing, whether that's through compromised credentials, whether that's through remote access that was not tied down, any and or all the above are part of that initial compromise that we have to be ready for and have to react to. Understanding the next steps is they will establish a foothold within the organization. So you'll see the MITRE ATT&CK framework. Column 3 is actually persistence. So that persistence foothold allows them easy access back and forth through the network and through their systems to continue doing their reconnaissance and understanding where the greatest vulnerabilities are. But also, really what they're looking for is where is the greatest data and what I want to get access to. That could be anything from, I jokingly say the KFC secret recipe. It could be understanding what is going to hurt this organization the most. And that's where ultimately, as we go through this process, when you actually wake up in the morning and your computers are locked down, understand there's an entire process that went on that you were unable to identify, unable to track beforehand. You'll hear from us kind of what we've learned in this process. You have to be more offensive and not defensive. Many organizations have a very defensive strategy. They have a lot of tools, so they're very tools rich and resource poor. Ultimately, you have to be offensive and hopefully take steps to break that foothold and that foothold in the organization. I think that's where we see the greatest opportunities for organizations moving forward. Joe, if you can flip to the next slide, thanks. So one of the things we start thinking about when I touched on this prior to the breach, what are they doing? They're conducting research. They're identifying potential opportunities within the organization. They want to make sure they understand what are the vulnerabilities on their website. How can they address and break through any vulnerabilities that are there? They're going to see, hey, what conferences are our employees attending? What are they doing? What are who's there? Who are the main players within the organization? And they're going to start looking at social media sites as well. This is all part of the process. And what I tell our clients, you have to treat ransomware gangs as if they're Fortune 100 companies. They have, again, this process through research and development. They are developing ransomware as a service. They are also, as part of this process, doing a lot of behind the scenes work to make sure that their deployment is going to be, successful. So what that first initial compromise, and the best way I can tell the story is actually a kind of real life story. 7 o'clock in the morning, you go to log in, your computer's locked down, and that first account now has been hijacked, and they're actually going through the system and locking everything down. Everyone's running around, crazy. Hey, I can't log in. I can't log in. The IT people are informed. The senior executives are informed. probably about 9:30, 10 o'clock, they start understanding, hey, we've been hit with some sort of ransomware, and they start deciding what's the next step. They institute their incident response plan, assuming they have one. Many times that plan really is call my insurance broker because they have cyber insurance. And on that insurance broker, as you start following that claim process, that insurance company will then identify, here are the companies that we have already approved as vendors relating to this. And they will help identify who is going to be able to help you get past this point. First things first, you're going to hire a breach coach. Next thing, you're going to hire a firm like ours to help identify and triage the situation and move through that process. But that first day, just to give you kind of a sense of it, you're probably not getting any help till tomorrow. In all reality, that's typically the way most of these engagements work. Typically, that first day is understanding what happened. Probably by 12 o'clock, 12:30, we're on call, scoping, spend the afternoon getting all of our paperwork signed, and by 5, 6 o'clock, on our team is probably flying out to be there first thing in the morning to help out the organization. But that literally is that first day of, oh my goodness, this actually happened to us. So as we start thinking about the process, as I talked about earlier, what are they doing? Establishing that foothold is critical to their ability to gain access to information within your organization. They're going to assess, what are those key elements and data elements that we have to worry about? Are we understanding what other weaknesses we have in our organization? And the question I always leave open to everyone, to our clients, is on the proactive side, have you done a penetration test? Have you assessed the vulnerabilities in your network? There's something that Carla talked about earlier. And you have to do that to make sure that these particular elements are closed down. I was on a call actually this morning with one of the large brokerage organizations that has a SWAT team. That SWAT team, there's a firm that only does penetration testing. They were in the middle of a penetration test while a company was being hit by ransomware. So they actually got stuck. Literally, their computers got stuck and tied directly to their client because of the ransomware attack. So again, you have to be mindful of how do we kind of break that persistence and being more offensive rather than defensive. So as we deploy the ransomware, that next part of that process, like I talked about, there's a lot of overwhelming effort here. IT is running around trying to, whether we have an outside vendor or we're doing it internally, everyone's overwhelmed because they don't know what's going on. They've never experienced this before. Employees are disoriented. Customers are confused because they can't access, any information. Again, I was on a call July 4th, literally that Sunday at 8:30 with about a 5,000 employee organization. And they, the CIO at 8:30 at night said, we're going to be up and running at 7 o'clock in the morning. And when I told him, I said, Michael, that's not happening. You just have to understand that. And let's kind of move this process forward because you're totally locked down and you do not have that capability. Fast forward 2.5 weeks later, they were just starting to get up and running, and they were mostly a call center. So having their phones working properly and having access to data was critical. They 2.5 weeks later were still not up and running fully, and their main clients are actually considering pulling out because of what is going on, and they were concerned that their data was being impacted. So again, this, as we start thinking about the risks relating to this, and Carla brought that up in her presentation, we have to understand what's greater risk, us not being up and running for 2.5, 3 weeks, and our customers wanting to leave our organization, or spending a bit more money than we had originally planned to help protect our organization. When we talk about the incident response plan and putting it into action, you have to evaluate what actually happened there. Like I said earlier, informing the insurance broker and the carrier is probably the first step. If you don't have cyber insurance, please go out and get some insurance. You need to have some, risk transfer here. Again, on a call I had this morning, what I'm hearing is many of the carriers are ramping down their plans. That $10 million plan is now not going to be available anymore from a protection point of view. They're only going to give out $5 million policies. They're also will not give you a policy if you do not have multi-factor authentication turned on. Also, if you've not had a pen test in the last 12 months, and if you don't have endpoint detection tools in place. These are some of the things that the insurance carriers are starting to put into place because they don't want to spend the money to pay out on the claims anymore. I will tell you, from January and through the end of June, We have not worked on a ransom case that the ransom has been less than $1 million. Just to give you an idea of this, and that is from 20-person companies all the way up to, again, much larger ones. We've had a few that are in 25 to $35 million range. But again, these are very large requests. This is how they make money, and we need to make sure we have the ability to cover ourselves, and that's where the insurance comes into play. So one thing that is important, and I implore you every single call I get. I had a call literally yesterday. Get a cyber attorney involved. They call them breach coaches. When you have an incident like this, one of the things that you have to understand is that your data was breached, and many times it was exfiltrated out of your organization. But at the very least, someone had access to the data that was not authorized, and there's data notification laws throughout this country and abroad that require nearly immediate notification 48, 72 hours after a breach is known. You have to make sure that you are following the regulatory guidelines, because you're going to see many of the regulatory bodies are starting to take hold. There was recently New York State Department of Financial Services has very strong cybersecurity rules, and just issued recently to a smallish mortgage broker organization a $1.5 million fine relating to failure to notify relating to a data breach. It's very important that we do this. Having a methodology to go through, this is our methodology. It's very similar to many others in terms of how the process works, and I've gone through it in some degree to help you understand exactly what goes on relating to this process, from the incident occurrence all the way through triage, all the way through forensic analysis and reporting. When the breach coach is there and they're helping you decide from the CEO perspective what you need to report on and what you don't need to report on, that is where that report and that forensic study really come into play, because you want to make sure that you have an appropriate plan in place to answer any claims we have against your organization. Hey, we did a full forensic review. This is what we found. This is what data was taken. We've notified the appropriate authorities relating to this. And, we are now, moving to remediation and restoration to get to a steady state. And that's part of that critical environment that we're trying to build here. So, again, appreciate everyone's time. And of course, open to any questions you may have.
Well, that was great. Thank you so much, Russell. A question that immediately came to my mind was of the ransomware attacks that you've been involved in, what % actually end up paying money?
Actually end up paying money. For us, it's probably been about a third. We're of the mindset similar to the FBI and other 3-letter agencies of not paying the ransom, but understand totally the business point of view of making that decision to pay a ransom. Probably about a third actually pay the ransom. Probably add another 20% on top of that start negotiation with a threat actor, but then actually don't either come through again because the dollars is just so large, and counsel and others have said no, we don't need to do it.
And for those that don't, how do they recover?
Some have strong backups, so that's a really big part of this. And if we start talking about how do we protect ourselves, having a very strong backup policy is critically important to helping them get back up and running. You're always going to lose some data either way, by the way, either on your backup side that doesn't always, you're not always able to bring it up, and also on we paid the ransom, we got a decrypted tool. That's not going to de-encrypt every file. You're always going to have issues where there are files that are not going to come back. The case I just talked about earlier, that particular company, that they did pay the ransom, and they were able to recover most of their employee files and working files, but not one of the executive files were able to be recovered, like that entire executive. So think of all your corporate documents, etc. Gone.
Gone. Bye-bye. Well, let's bring in Carla and let's bring in Mike for their response. Carla?
Yeah, I thought there was a lot of great topics in there. I wanted to hit a little bit on the insurance piece that Russell talked about. We work really closely with AIG, and they have determined, they're getting killed with ransomware right now, just like Russell said. Their premiums have gone up, I believe, almost 40% this year alone. They're getting much stricter on their underwriting process. But what they have done that's interesting is they will pay for certain risk mitigation things that they believe actually decreases their risk. So if you have your cyber insurance through AIG, you qualify or should qualify for our employee training, phishing, vulnerability assessments, things like that. And AIG pays for that because they feel that it decreases their risk by so much. The other thing I wanted to talk about a little bit is, we're all on the preventative, proactive side. So we are doing the tabletop incident response exercises. And it's so interesting if you look at the statistics of how many people say they have an incident response plan, and then you go to practice it. Well, they don't know where it's at. It's on a computer that, if they get hit, they're not going to have access to it. And they don't know their roles and responsibilities. So I always call it kind of the fourth grade fire drill. If you have an incident response plan, you should be practicing it. Everybody should know their roles and responsibility and what square they go to in that parking lot when the fire alarm rings, kind of type thing. And I think if they did that, maybe the remediation piece of it might be a little bit smoother.
Great. Thank you, Carla. Mike, what would you like to add?
I think it's fantastic. I really enjoyed how Russell talked about how there are no boundaries. He mentioned the $1 million minimum. That's what the FBI is always telling people. That's what we're telling people is these attackers, they have no limitations. They've got unlimited money, they've got unlimited time, and they have unlimited skills. So it's a huge adversary you're up against. And I'm sure everyone noticed our approach is very much preventative on a technical side, things you can do with technology to keep bad things from happening. But I really enjoyed how Russell went through and showed the methodologies. How do these attackers get started? What do they do next? What are they following the MITRE so that what they've done to you? And then he followed up with, here's how to respond if this horrible thing ends up happening, which I certainly hope it doesn't. Something else I really enjoyed him pointing out is the 4th of July date. Attackers love to attack on holidays, and that's one of the biggest times. You saw the Target huge breach that happened. That was between Thanksgiving and New Year's when they started gathering information, but it was a time during the holidays where there are not a lot of people to respond if they get detected, and it's certainly not a good time for Target to shut down all their stores. So having holidays is almost a risky time for organizations as far as their cybersecurity goes if attackers have been in the system and they're dwelling and waiting for that. But loved all the stuff Russell talked about. So solid.
Appreciate it, Mike. Yeah.
There's no place to hide, no place to run. Also, we had a question come in, and I'd love to hear your opinion on this. If you pay ransom, how can you trust what's left behind and that no malicious code has been left behind? What can you recommend for that? So I get hacked, I pay them off, I get the codes. How do I know they're out of the system?
Yeah, you're going to have to rely on your forensics firm that's helping facilitate that process. That I know when we get the tools in place, etc. We test them in a sandbox outside of obviously any of our networks and theirs, and go through that process to make sure there's no malicious code embedded in it. So that code review is critically important. And then additionally, as you're going through the other side of it, which I talked about earlier about being more offensive rather than defensive, making sure you're going through the files that are there as well and doing your forensic review to make sure that there's no malicious activity at all happening there. If you're seeing, let's say, Bulgaria being pinged at 2:30 in the morning and you have no employees there, that's indicator number one, right? That they're still hanging around in your network, and we got to break that persistence. It's very important. And just one other point, Carla and Mike both made about testing. I have one experience I think it's pretty telling. A long time ago, probably when I still had hair, I was chief auditor for a bank, and we went through our disaster recovery test just as all banks have to do. Saturday night, we're in the main office. We had binders, right? Because there was no computers back then. We had binders, and we go through the testing. And they shut off the power. There's 20 of us laughing in that particular office because we didn't bring flashlights. That was the test, right? We forgot something, and going through the test identified a weakness in our test, which was the piece of paper binder can't be read in the dark. So you just always want to be able to understand where you are and what the risks are if you don't go through that process at least once.
The famous lesson of no plan survives contact with the enemy.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, exactly.
A question that came in, I want to make sure we touch on this. Anyone can answer this. Is multi-factor authentication enough for VPNs? Mike, I'll go to you because it sounds like that's a hybrid question.
Yes, thank you. That's, if I had to pick one thing I wanted to communicate through my presentation, that's it. And chances are the person who asked that question has heard me present. And he's like, yeah, I know Mike's hotspot, because we do run into that so often that IT professionals are even shocked that an attacker managed to get into their system because they had two-step verification. And that is the number one point of what I talked about, as the person who asked that question very well knows, that this would trigger me is, please, please, please know that once an attacker gets into a remote computer, that user has already logged onto your system. So it doesn't matter if it's a DNA test. The two-factor does not help if an attacker has taken over that remote computer. Basically, the user's logging onto the cloud for the attacker. The user's logging onto your network for the attacker. The user connects to the VPN for the attacker. So the attacker just kind of sits there in the back seat waiting. And as soon as that user logs on, whether it's two-factor or not, then the attacker pounces and goes right in through the hole that the user opened up for them. So have two-step verification, but please do not ever make the mistake of thinking that that's enough. You've got to harden that remote machine. You've got to make sure that remote machine cannot get in. And at the office side too, you need to be filtering, make it too difficult for that bear to climb into the barn. You can't do that at all. You've got to, if you don't let the bears in and you make sure and keep the remote system so protected and an attacker can't take over it, then take it over, then that's great. And multi-factor is great to keep some guy from Albonia from logging into your system if the guy in Albonia figures out the username and password. So two-factor is very, very important, but it's not going to stop an attacker who's taken over a computer of one of your remote users.
Thanks, Mike. I'm going to have bears in my dreams for the next week, so appreciate that.
With hoodies.
At least, right. Well, let's move on because I want to touch on this because we've talked about the impact of business, how they go after business, all the great information you guys shared. But we're also individuals and we have families. And I've got my local network here. What should we be doing as individuals on a personal level to protect myself and to protect my family? And if each of you could just throw out one, what are the things individually should be doing? And Carla, I'll start with you.
So within our organization, I have our IT company or our IT person available to go to everybody's house and help set up their Wi-Fi. You know, their Wi-Fi shouldn't extend to their neighbor's house. They should have maybe a dedicated Wi-Fi just for their work. But our IT person is available to go to any of our employees' house or talk them through how to make sure that their home networks are secure.
Wow, what a great benefit to be part of Techguard Security. Mike, how about you? What's your thought?
Oh, I have a list of 12 items that I'd be happy to make available for free to anyone about what to do with family computers. But it boils down to making sure you uninstall software that you don't need, because every program you have installed is another way for an attacker to get in. Set up that two-step verification we just talked about is absolutely essential. There's so many things like blocking the firewall so it can't get to. I heard earlier Russell talked about if you see one of your servers contacting, then he said the name of a country, then all of your home networks should already be configured so they will not speak outside of wherever your users, in this case your family, wants to go visit. That reduces a lot of problems there. The attackers put what are called command and control servers out on the network, and then the viruses in your machine have to reach out to those servers to find out what to do next. Just because attackers cannot send commands into your system because your firewall will block that, if there's something on the inside asking, hey, command and control, what should I do now? That server will respond. So if you've blocked as many of those sources for command and control servers as possible, that's a great thing. Anyway, I'd be happy to send the 12 items to someone, and we will not put you on any spam list.
Mike, is that true of the apps I have on my phone or my iPad?
Sure, of course. Yes. Everything you have that you're not using, please uninstall it. Please remove it. I mean, the whole SolarWinds thing, SolarWinds is great, but companies that didn't have SolarWinds weren't affected. The big Kaspersky breach, Kaspersky is awesome. Companies who didn't have Kaspersky weren't affected. Exchange servers breached if companies had local exchange servers. Didn't affect you if people didn't have a local exchange server. So yes, absolutely. Just remove every application that's not essential. Get it off your systems.
Great. Thank you, Mike. Russell, bring us home. What's your thought?
And I'm going to tell you a quick story. So I tell the story all the time. My family hates me, right? And why is that? You know, I make them change their iCloud and Gmail passwords every 30 days. And so they're like, oh, Dad, leave me alone about this. But think about your life and think about everything you have, probably in those two areas. Make sure your passwords are difficult and that they're unique to those particular systems. Same thing with your banking and other information. But I think those, if you start thinking about your life and how you manage it, and what information you have, if I gave one thing, it's change your passwords.
How do you feel about password managers versus the spreadsheet my wife maintains that's titled passwords?
Yeah, someone's going to get into your network and get all your passwords, right? That's the easy thing, right? If you want to have a pad and paper, write it down. I'm okay with that. I actually use a password manager. It's just easier. Is it perfect? No. Can they get compromised? Yes. But at least you have something that's giving you the ability to maintain all of our passwords. There's some study about some ridiculous number of passwords you have to remember. There's no way we could do that, in our heads.
Right. Well, listen, I'd like to thank each of you, Carla Stone, Mike Foster, Russell Saperstein, for bringing your expertise, bringing your A game today, and shining a light on so many important issues we need to know about cyber. One of my personal missions has been to continuously raise that percentage of Vistage members that are fully protected and are fully prepared to defend in this aggressive war. I know it's a long haul, and I know there'll always be people to be hit, but now the more people we expose this to, the more people that are aware of this, they can now make informed decisions and choose for themselves whether the risk outweighs the cost. So again, thank you, Carla, Mike, and Russell. Greatly appreciate your input and your insights today. The whole community thanks you. And with that, I will close out today's session. Oops, sorry. We'll close out today's session. And again, thanks to our guests. And we'll hope you'll join us on August 27th for Make or Break Executions, 1 hour to up your execution game. Our presenter will be award-winning Vistage speaker, Dan Barnett. Register at vistage.com/webinars. That's vistage.com/webinar. Thank you for your time today. Please practice cybersecurity and stay safe. I'm Joe Galvin, Chief Research Officer from Vistage. Thank you for your time.